Hello, travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast 4th season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. Enjoy this amazing interview because Paul Jenkins boards the mothership. He's the creator of the Sentry from Marvel. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Jenkins. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
It's totally an honor to talk with you, sir. I got to meet you in Providence, maybe going back, God, maybe 7 years ago or so. I got an autograph from you. It was very cool. I think it was for back in the day of Aftershock, I think.
Okay,
It was very
fantastic.
cool to meet you in person. So I always found a question of inspiration. So inspired your love for comics and who are your earliest influences?
What were my earliest influences in comics? Um, I have some sort of unusual influences. When I was a kid, I did not really get a chance to see many comics, because my brother and I didn't really have any, but we had a bunch of weird and eclectic comics. We used to get the black and white reprints of the EC comics. So it was like Uncanny Tales and Amazing Fantasy. And you could say that was the way in which comics like sparked my imagination. But the we used to get a lot of British like war comics because there was these really tiny digest sized comics called Commando and things like that. Garth Ennis, by the way, is also really into these. He talks about those all the time. Um, And then obviously for Brits, it was 2000 AD. And I remember when issue one of that came out and it was just like, this is amazing. But there were a couple of other books that came out with it. There was a comic called Action Comics that was really 2000 AD, but very violent. So it was like even more violent than 2000 AD is pretty good thing to write home about. So, I think we didn't really have a massive influence of American comics. I saw couple of Spider-Mans, saw a couple of Daredevils, but I didn't know that much about them.
So how did it impact how you approached writing for comics that you didn't have this big long history of American comic books as you became famous for writing so many famous American comics?
Well, I've spoken about it a few times, Jeff, but I think that's actually the part that made me quite lucky, right?
Hmm.
I think the fact that I didn't know too much about American comics meant that I wasn't stuck in the continuity of 170 issues of Spider-Man or Daredevil. I've often talked to American writers, and obviously they love that when they make their way into comics, or that some of them are massive comic book fans. But I feel that it might be an advantage for me that I wasn't because I'm a writer that happened to work in comics. I didn't intend to either. I studied to be a filmmaker. I studied to be an actor as well. And so I found my way into comics because I met the guys that created the Ninja Turtles, and then one thing led to another. And then I ended up being a freelance creator afterwards. So I famously, when I won an Eisner for Inhumans, I'd never heard of them before. And I just read a couple of 5-page comics by Jack Kirby and said, okay, I get it. And I was able to write what seemed to be a fresh take. And if I can, I'll give you this, there's like 1 minute anecdote that's actually pretty funny.
Okay.
Um, I wrote Karnak the Shatterer. He's the character that sort of presses something, and if it's a bottle or something, it just kind of shatters, because he can see the weakness in anything. And I wrote him as the advisor to the king, Black Bolt,
Hmm.
who would advise the king on weaknesses in human society and in the city. Yeah. Um, and everybody said, wow, Paul Jenkins is a genius. What an amazing idea to do with Karnak. And I said, oh, I'm really sorry. I thought that's what he did
That's awesome.
because I didn't know any better.
So because there's a big deal right now in media, you created probably one of the most famous characters come out of comics in the last 30 years. We're going to talk about the Sentry a bit, and we're going to a bit of Meta Studios. And like they're in the last 30 years, it really Sentry really has been like the character that I think has broken through the most of new characters in that span of time. What do you think it was about the Sentry that has endured so well over the last 3 decades?
Well, I think if you're going to create a character of any kind that has endurance that can last any time, it probably needs to be a reflection of its audience. Yeah. Um, all of these superhero characters are wish fulfillment, aren't they? I mean, none of us has really got any superpowers. But I used to kind of say to people that I thought Spider-Man, like my version of Spider-Man, was a guy who just he would have been a teacher if he wasn't Spider-Man. The kind of personality you have is this long-suffering guy that would always do his duty. That's just something that we can see in ourselves. We sometimes do our duty. If we're parents, for example, we look after our kids, and it's relatively selfless if we're getting it right. So the Sentry was always a story about the challenges of mental health. And it's not necessarily whether or someone is dealing with a mental illness, which might be schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but more like all of us have stresses. We all have challenges. We all have things in our lives, maybe stuff from our childhood, maybe stuff from our present day. And so I feel that anyone looking at a guy that's got an incredible power, I always wanted to build it so that we had this hyper advantage and this disadvantage. And it was the collision in the middle that was the person, which we all are. So we can see ourselves as the Sentry.
Now, the thing with the Sentry is it's very much connected to the super serum, a form of the super serum that Captain America has and whatnot. And the idea is that with the serum, it magnifies your strengths, but also magnifies your weaknesses.
Mhm.
If you're thinking about the Sentry, what strength did you view as being the most magnified by having the sudden power, and which part is that got magnified? Is it just from the negative side, the idea of that void inside yourself, or was something more to it that got maybe the need for the idea of addiction? Condition itself is the disease, that the need to fixate on this thing. So when you were thought about in those terms, what were your considerations?
Well, I mean, okay, so the way that I had created it, first thing I did, it's worth mentioning like the creation of character. It was originally conceived as a story for Our Man when I was working at Vertigo. And I really wanted to write the idea that somebody would be addicted to the pill that makes them a superhero for 1 hour. And
Mhm.
then, they couldn't take it for a while. So they would have this incredible addiction and it would be really, really difficult to overcome. It was a story about addiction only. And then that didn't go. And Karen Berger, the editor-in-chief at Vertigo, said, look, you should create a new character to see if it would work. And it really didn't for a while. It didn't really take off at DC or Marvel. But the whole point of it was that in some ways he was a Superman analog. And then people kind of moan about that and say, well, but yeah, while he's a clone of no, he wasn't a clone of Superman. There were elements of the Superman story that were fascinating to me. For example, this idealized person that stood in the American flag and stood on the edge of a parapet somewhere with his cape flowing. It's almost like watching a flag, the the American flag, right? It was an idealized version of self. And then, of course, if you look at people who struggle with depression, who struggle with mental illness of some kind, a lot of the challenges that people have will be there's an idealized version for a bit. There's an up, there's the honeymoon period of self, there's that bit where you feel great, there's nothing you can't do. But some of that tends towards mania. And even then, with Sentry, I think that when we presented him, there was an element of it that was just a bit edgy and a little bit manic. He was so perfect. He was so good. And that just didn't seem quite right. And then, the same token, then the self-doubt and the self-loathing became the void. And so the way that I built it was that he was schizophrenic. And when he became the Sentry, he also became the void at the same time. And then the two of them were destined to fight each other because that's what we do. We have competing parts of our personality. We're all children of duality, I suppose.
Mhm.
So it wasn't necessarily one aspect; it was self-loathing and it was self-belief, but both of them were unrealistic.
So when thinking about Robert Reynolds, who for those who everyone knows now he's the Sentry, but Robert Reynolds as an individual, as neither the Sentry nor the Void, but the guy individual himself, do you view him as ultimately heroic? Um, did he do the right thing because he knew to be right, or did he do it because it made him feel good and powerful to do what was right?
That's probably a question of philosophy and or psychology and psychiatry, right? Like the question you just asked isn't a question of Robert Reynolds, it's a question of all of us. Do
Hmm.
we love people because we love them and we care for them? Or do we love them because we need company? Do we do good things because we expect a reward in heaven? Do we do good things because we're just nice people? Or do we do them for other reasons, right? And I think maybe you're hitting on the whole core of the Sentry because
Hmm.
it's not the Sentry and it's not the Void, it's Robert Reynolds, it's Bob. Yeah, he's the story. And I do think that in the end, the way that I presented him, and hopefully, you kind of see it in the film a little bit. He's a guy that wanted to do okay, but he had these real challenges that he couldn't overcome, or he was struggling to overcome. But at his core, he was a nice guy, he was a good guy, and he just wants to try to do better. In my story, I think that he commits the ultimate act of heroism. He gives up his heroism so that he can save the world from the void. That's an incredibly heroic act. So he's a hero.
And when you're thinking, I was thinking about, I can't remember the name of the Egyptian god who weighs your soul, and if you're later is weighs later than a feather, you can go to like the happy after. I can't remember the exact. The,
It's probably the god of the dead.
yeah, yeah, it may
Anubis or
be
something.
Anubis. It could be Anubis.
Yeah, it's Anubis.
And I'm thinking of again, it brought me to the idea again of Bob Robert Reynolds, someone because he does have that void side, and it does say that for every good thing he's doing, the void is doing something oppositely evil.
Yeah.
Um, is there a road where what he did was did he do could he do enough good to outweigh the damage he was also doing as the void? Is that
Yeah. Because okay, so maybe a good way to address that answer, to answer that question, is to say, look, there doesn't need to be an answer, right? The best stories do not need an answer at the end. They
hmm,
need a question that gets raised. So does his good side outweigh his bad side? Can he ever atone for the bad things that the void does? Can he accept the good things that the Sentry does without beating himself and the world up as the void, right? I'm not going to give you the answer to that because I don't think you should. I think the reason why he was a character that endured and the reason why the couple of runs that I had on him was successful in the way that they were was because they all raised the question.
and I think that's a great thing. But like, because I really do. Sentry was my favorite character when it was from the created from 2000 and up. I bought most of his appearances that showed up. And I think what was interesting about him is the idea of the collateral damage. Because with Spider-Man, he just does heroic things, and he doesn't really everything just works out well. Superman throws people through buildings, and I guess no one was ever in those buildings because everyone is just lucky that no one ever got hurt. He never killed anybody. I kind of feel like Robert Reynolds is the realistic view of do any if you, the, at the moment you have power, the moment you try to wield it, even in the force of good, people around you are going to get hurt because it's a big, busy, crazy world. And that's just how these things work.
Yeah.
Um, did what did you think about that as well? The idea of why aren't these other heroes dealing with collateral damage of what they're trying to do?
Well, if I think I sort of point to the second series that I wrote, right?
Yeah.
When I did that, there was a lot going on. Robert lived with Lindy in the Watchtower, so now, he was husband and wife. They were living as husband and wife, and they were living that way. But there were some challenges for the Sentry. The Sentry would always have the supercomputer clock that would tell him, well, you got 15 seconds to get to a mineshaft disaster in Poland, and then you got this happening, and then this is happening. So it predict everything for him, and they were he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, yeah.
Hmm.
And so he had to manage that, but maybe have dinner with his wife. What do you say? What do you not do? Which disaster do you not go and save? How many people will die because you could have saved them but you didn't, right?
Hmm.
And so as that as that series developed, you could see that that wasn't the case. That in fact, if he saved somebody, then an equal amount of people would get killed by the void. The void. If he would be nice to someone, the void would give someone else cancer.
Yeah.
And really, he was the void, and he was fooling himself because he's mentally ill and he has some challenges. He was fooling other people. He was trying to keep it all together, and he couldn't keep it all together. And so I think, instead of sort of looking at whether or not there was a finite kind of thing, especially this thing where you've got there's an equal and opposite reaction. There was never a way for him to win as the Sentry because he would always, in his own mind, have to compensate for the void. And the void would do something bad because he couldn't overcome. What was he doing throughout that series? He was basically in therapy. And he was
Hmm.
going to see a doctor to see if he could work his way through it. But if you look into the way that story was written, as he would go to his therapist, he was always make excuses and leave early and not quite answer the question. All right, which meant that he wasn't actually responding to the sort of therapy that he was undergoing, which happens to a lot of people.
And I really do like they did like that kind of like dark calculus where know because someone like Superman. and Sentry has to deal with the fact that they can help multiple people around the world. I mean, Spider-Man, you're kind of stuck in New York. There's only so much time you have to go around and stop something in California. Spider-Man can't get that fast.
Mhm.
But Sentry can, Superman can, those characters can. You have to make a decision which conflicts you get involved with, who you're allowed to die. That must be one of the most heaviest weights to deal with, is the decision that he has to make almost every single day, which people are allowed to die, because I feel like this one's a little more important over here.
Yeah, like what would you do if you knew that you might get a sense that, two people get run over on a crossing and one of them's a kid? It's almost like the trolley problem.
Yeah,
Right? It's the trolley problem, and there's no answer to the trolley problem. You
you
can't
know,
answer it.
it was one of my favorite TV shows, The Good Place. I don't know if you ever saw that show when they did the trolley problem episode.
Yeah,
Great episode. They had because it's in a fake, it's in like in a heaven world. A demon had them do the trolley problem. They introduced it. It was very interesting. So
yeah.
it was fascinating. I think the other interesting about the Sentry is that I kind of feel like he's kind of like believing himself into existence, as it were. I will be the Sentry, so I'm going to go and just do it. I have that power. At the same time, obviously, you said the void. Is he an example of trying to become to force oneself to be the person they wish they could be?
Mm,
Because the Sentry is an idea. And when you have those issues of the pages where he's kind of like the 60s kind of version of him, they have the cartoon world with viewed in the world comics and what he really would be.
yeah.
He is clearly, when they looked, kind of pulled the curtains away, not exactly the person he thought he was, but he was trying to force himself to be the person he wanted to be.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I think that was a very interesting way. And did you kind of view him that way as well?
Well, I mean, so yes, I do. I did say earlier that I felt that the Sentry was kind of like an idealized version of self, and the Void was the sort of the place where Bob beat himself up, and that was the opposite, right? People all across the world have a version of themselves that they're hoping to be. They have a version of themselves that they're not really that happy with. You might have, no one has it this exact equality like Bob has fashioned for himself, where one action becomes the opposite action as well. Um, but what I felt was interesting was that, and I think Jake Schreier talked about this when he made the film, and Lewis Pullman did as well. When they presented Lewis as the Sentry, he did not look comfortable in the Sentry suit. That this was him, but it kind of wasn't him at the same time.
Hmm.
The void was something that Lewis couldn't fight. I say Lewis, sorry, Lewis. That the Sentry couldn't fight. That Bob couldn't fight. Right? You know, um, he couldn't overcome it. Right? There was
Hmm.
nothing he could do about it. But there was, right. He had to fight himself. He had to like overcome his fears. He had to overcome the self-loathing. Um, and so, I didn't really ever see it as this finite thing, Jeff. It's not like one thing or the other, because I think that we have a tendency, especially in the age of the internet, it's either this or it's not. It's red or blue. It's politics. It's Republican or Democrat. Everything's one or two, right? But that's never the way that things really are. And so there is nuance to the Sentry all the way through. Because do you not have nuance in your life? I have nuance in my life. And I think that's the best way to look at the Sentry. There can't be an answer from the Sentry.
No, I would definitely say he probably falls into the idea of the tragic hero. Obviously, every tragic hero does have the tragic flaw. Is the tragic flaw the addiction, or is there something else that would count as his tragic flaw in your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think his addiction led him into bad places. And so why do people become addicts? There's many reasons. There's childhood reasons. There's just simply, especially with alcoholism at times, there's just simply the overuse of alcohol can literally make you an addict, right? And so there could have been any of those things that led him to that addiction. But I don't, that's a flaw. But I think his tragic flaw is that he can't forgive himself, because this is the issue of people who are struggling with mental illness at times. Imagine that you have this challenge of mental illness, right? Sometimes it's just, you're not feeling right, you're not feeling good about yourself. And so you blame yourself for not feeling very good right now. And
Mhm.
that's not a flaw. but it's the tragedy of it all, right? Is that people who struggle with mental illness, sometimes they feel worthless and they feel really bad about themselves simply because they feel bad. It's almost like a brain trauma because the brain chemistry isn't giving them enough of certain substances like serotonin or dopamine.
And I think the very interesting idea is when you created the Void, which I mean, at least I think that the idea of the Sentry and the Void is they were definitely the most. It's just you did a fascinating character job of like creating this character. The idea that you could pull people into like this dark shadows to kind of like relive their worst moments, and I'm looking at that as the idea that everyone has then a void in them.
Yeah.
Does that mean are they all like literally part of the void on some level then, or how did you view that?
Well, okay, so we're talking with superhero fiction, we're talking with like big fiction, right?
Hmm.
I had previously, or at a certain point, I explored some of these ideas, not previously, I should say. When I wrote the Hulk, right, that the Hulk was an aspect of Bruce Banner's personality, and I had lots of them. I had the Devil Hulk, which is the really bad one. We had, the one that was clever, the one that was fooling himself, the one that was like the one that felt worthless. So there were lots of Hulks inside Bruce Banner, but the one with the rage was the one that came out the most, yeah. And so, that is also true of Sentry in some ways. That I don't think that he I think that Bob is just like any of us. We all have a dark and a light side, but that's too simple because that just makes it binary, and it's not binary. We have good and bad days. And I also think it's worth thinking about as well. Let's say that somebody's wealthy and we say, well, they have no money problems. Well, let me tell you something. When they start losing their money and all of a sudden they can't keep their world together, that's as stressful, I'm sure, as it is in any other person that doesn't have as much money, right? And so, we all have these challenges of things that we're supposed to deal with. And Sentry really speaks to that. It doesn't give an answer, like I keep saying. It's more that the nuance of it is that we are the person stuck in the middle of our two competing sides. Sometimes we overcome them really well, other times we really struggle with it, but that's just how the human condition is. And that's what it is for Bob, and it's really an exploration of that.
And I think that's awesome. Another interesting with we thinking about the Sentry as well is that like all characters, there's the introduction to the character, then you gotta like develop the character. Now, initially, the Sentry was written as this miniseries. Um, I think even in the miniseries, though I'm not positive, it wasn't necessarily point supposed to be immediately into continuity. It was like a story of like what if this character did exist, and then he
Mm.
was brought into continuity. Is that correct? Am I understanding how that played out?
That's kind of a yes and no to that, actually.
Okay.
So I created the Sentry in 1995, and at that time, um, I had wanted to write that story, and I had started with what essentially is the first issue of the Sentry miniseries that we wrote. The first one ever was just going to be a story where thinks he may have been a hero, and we finally get to the point where we're like, this guy couldn't have been a hero, because there's actually a scene in the first issue where he puts a coat on, and it's an old coat, just a brown coat. And he steps outside and says, "Oh, it feels great to wear the Sentry suit again." And the entire audience would say, "Oh, obviously there's a problem with this guy." And then he walks outside and he walks up into the sky, and
Hmm.
it leaves with a question, as I keep saying, right? Now, after that, that was a Vertigo pitch, and Vertigo didn't want to do it. And so I expanded it because I thought that there would be a really good idea that what if this guy had just been forgotten and he came back and, he had all these things. And that was expanded, especially with I really love the idea of using the comics as a storytelling method. The evolution of comics through the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s was very integral to the way that we received the Sentry because he had been there that entire time. But, once and so from that, the whole idea that he'd been sent away, that he'd given up his own harem, all of that existed. All of that was in the original pitch to DC Comics, which didn't go anywhere, right? But I felt that was, looking back at it recently, I looked back on that original pitch and went like, man, it was all in there. Like everything was right there. And I think it could always have been something where he would live beyond the miniseries. But we just put him in a place that was nice and neat at the end of the miniseries where he had forgotten himself again. And then it was up to, at the time, Brian Bendis to put him in the Avengers, and he was in the raft, and he thought he'd killed his wife and stuff like that. That was fine because the whole point was that he was a character with substance. So go ahead and play. Go ahead, Brian, and make a story. That's great.
Is it hard to watch other writers play with your baby, as it were?
No, because when I took over, I've said this a few times as well. When I took over Hellblazer, I took over on a very successful run that Garth Ennis had had. So people might have asked Garth, "Well, what do you think about the next person?" To which Garth would say, "I don't know, I did mine." And then people would say to me, because I wrote more issues of Hellblazer than anyone, "What do you think of the next person?" To which my answer is, I'm not going to say what I think, good or bad, right? Because I don't. It's their turn to write it. Now, with Sentry, obviously, there were some things that I do think we could have done. I wish I had written a very specific psychological profile for him with a diagnosis, and I handed that to Marvel and said, I think you're going to have a lot of success if we follow this path with the Sentry.
Hmm.
Here's his diagnosis. This would allow people to literally have a real consistency. But I don't think that was really followed. So at times he became a little bit of a mustachio twirling villain that would just yell and like be crazy and like crazy for the sake of crazy. And
Yeah.
I think that doesn't represent a lot of research and a lot of effort put in. I think you should always try to write him as a person.
See, that's what I was wondering because, like I said, because you have your two miniseries, but then he had New Avengers, and I think it was the Dark Avengers, a bunch of other stories. Do you think some writers lost some of the character along the way?
Well, I would say this probably the better way of answering it because I'm never going to be drawn into do I think another writer did it wrong or right, right? That just won't happen with me because I never
Right.
will. I'm supportive of any other writer that ever attempted to write anything because that's their way of doing it. And if I just because it may not have been my way of doing it, I'm never going to criticize them because they had a different story to tell. Instead, I would say this, that I think the consistency that I suggested with his diagnosis would have actually helped all of the other writers
Hmm.
because I think so the only version of the Sentry that I would just say I really don't like that myself is the bit where he's crazy for the sake of being crazy. Hey, he's crazy because he showed up and he's mental, and you're sort of sitting there going, "Well, who gives a fuck?" Right? Like I hate that. I hate the idea that he's crazy because he's crazy, right? Like a lot of villains, do you know you have to be really careful when you're writing villains, right? They have to believe their own story. You kind of, in some ways, you can often like agree with them, but you just don't agree with their methods, right? That there's not that much wrong in what they're saying about society, for example, but the idea that they're going to torture 100 people to get their revenge is not a good thing, right? And so that's the bit that I just found. I would find that very lazy and uninspiring.
Hmm.
He's crazy because he does crazy stuff. There's no one in the world that's crazy because they do crazy stuff, except extremely mentally ill people who are delusional and really struggling with stuff. But they're not very common in some ways. Most people have a mental health challenge that they're really struggling with, and they're trying to improve, and sometimes they're not. Some days are good, some days are bad. That's the nuance of real characterization and storytelling. And crazy guys flying around in gold isn't one of them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, without going to specific writers, because I do agree with you. I wouldn't want to crap on any specific writer because one, they could be against my show one day, so I would hate to go after them at any point. But I would say the two much. I think some issues with Sanchez later on became either I think they got lost more into the void part of him than the
Mhm.
Bob part.
Yeah.
And the also issue is that the Million Exploding Sun part, where he came in to beat any to show how strong either a villain was or he was, versus, as you said, the development of this guy as
It,
Bob.
everything about it should have been Bob, right?
Right.
And everything else is interesting and it's got window dressing and you can be the golden guardian, the good, and the creature of the blackest night. And all of that's fun, but it's all about Bob. And I think, I can actually relay this, Jeff, because there's actually a comparison I can make with the Inhumans.
Hmm.
So, coming to Marvel, I haven't really written much for them except Werewolf by Night. And that was a horror title, and I wasn't really a horror guy, but I was writing Hellblazer and Werewolf by Night, and that was weird. And And so the first thing I really write for them is the Inhumans. And one of the things that I now in hindsight can say, I know why we won an Eisner and why everyone else has not been able to really do the Inhumans very well since. I think there have actually been some good ones since, but it was certainly a struggle before we took over. And you know why? Because the whole point of Black Bolt as a character is that he cannot speak.
Hmm.
If he speaks, everything blows up, and that's not a good thing. You don't want everything blow up. And so everyone before me had actually had a bit where he blows stuff up and he's too powerful and it all explodes and visually it looks great. But for the character, it doesn't work because he's the king. He's not supposed to speak. It's a metaphor for, that bit where the president or the king shouldn't really speak their mind. Otherwise, it creates a constitutional crisis,
Hmm.
right? And so I wrote him like that and he never speaks. And I remember somewhere in it, around about issue 8, 9, 10, fans would write in and they say, when's he going to say something? And I'm like, this is the first time that you've ever cared about him. You're waiting for him to say something. And he never did in my series, right? He never said a word in the book that Jay and I did. And there was this really cool thing about him. He had never been defeated in battle, and that was something Marvel had. In the very next series, he got defeated in battle, and he leans out his front door and tells the people in his yard to get lost, and everything blows up. It was the core of the character that he can't speak.
Hmm.
So that takes you to sort of answering that question about the Sentry, right? That the void is the creature of the blackest night, and you're trying to avoid the thing. Like the way I wrote him returning as the void was the worst thing that had happened to New York in decades. That the void was so dangerous and awful, and the Sentry returning was something that was a big mega event. It was like all of that had meaning because it was all about this duality of the Sentry and the void and Bob. Bob's the important part,
Hmm.
and the rest of it is just window dressing. But it's great window dressing and do great stories with it, but it's window dressing.
Now, another part that became connected with the Sentry a lot, and in the movie as well, is the tendency for him to be manipulated by stronger villains, sort of more in control, like Norman Osborn, things of that nature. Do you think that is a natural aspect of his character, or do you think that's something that other writers decided to grab onto?
I can never tell, right? I remember that there was a conversation I once had with Eddie Berganza, who had been the Superman editor. And Eddie was talking to me about what would you do if you came over to do Superman? And part of it was like, not much, Eddie. I've already done it with Sentry, right? But I remember saying to him, look, the way that I would get to Superman, if he's so invulnerable and all that, is I would put a gun to Mark Kent's head, and Lex Luthor would say, "Hey, you faster than a speeding bullet," and blow her fucking brains out, right? And that would be something that Superman couldn't reconcile. He wouldn't be able to do it. Now, I did that scene in the second. Actually, the Void, I think, is like got Lindy, and he's sort of like saying, "Hey, can you faster than a speeding bullet?" And he fires, and the Sentry says, "Yeah," and holds up the bullet, right? So it was kind of a cool thing. The idea being you're better off doing this thing where you get into the mind, right? It's the mental side of it that gets the Sentry every time. It's Bob. It's the Void and Sentry and duality, or the sort of triangle of those three entities that does it. The only difference, it originally started that I had written that when he became the Sentry, he at the same time became the Void. So the two of them existed in space at the same time. I think the movies really changed that to he becomes a Sentry, then he jumps into the void kind of thing.
Hmm. Now, no, as you mentioned the movie, obviously Thunderbolts was a great movie. Very big, and Sentry was a major part of it. How does it feel to now have a character that is, for all intents and purposes, now a household name? Everyone knows the Sentry. It's like every other Marvel character, you know who the Sentry is. Was that like for you?
um, yeah, pretty nice. It's kind of bittersweet in some ways. It was very hard to get the Sentry published at first, and then when we did the Inhumans, Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti understood me a bit, maybe, and they understood why maybe we could do it. And certainly it became the Sentry because Jay Lee, who I had done so well with on Inhumans, said, I want to do this report. Like Jay and I were being touted to maybe do a Namor miniseries or anything else, really. We could have done whatever we wanted, I think, within reason. But really, Jay said yes to the Sentry, and I'll forever be grateful to him for that because without him saying that, it would never have been a character. So how does it feel now? It feels great. It's validating. I think the best part of it is just because this is me, this is the way I am. The best part of it is how many people who are struggling with mental health challenges reach out to me and say, "Thank you so much. The Sentry is my favorite character. I
Cool.
see myself in him, etc., etc." That means a lot to me. That means a lot more to me than the recognition.
Now, when they were developing Sentry for the film, did they talk to you and be like, "What did you think about how we're developing him or showing him in the film?" Or is it film Sentry and it's just clearly not comic
No,
books?
no, I worked on the film. I live in Atlanta, right? So they shot
Yeah.
it here. So no, I consulted with Jake. I mean, it was really nice. Jake's a great guy, and he's really smart, and I think he made a great film. And so yeah, absolutely. In fact, I worked on it and consulted on the film.
And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that the way I mean these are mega corporations, obviously DC, Warner Brothers, Disney, and Marvel. So when anytime a character starts being introduced in another media, there's a resurgence of interest in the world of comic books for the character again.
Mhm.
Being the creator, is there now a temptation to revisit the character again in a miniseries or something to kind of because I mean he has now at the most popular point in his creation so far.
Yeah, yeah. First of all, there are a couple of things I would say to that. Number one. I always conceived of the Sentry as a bit of a trilogy in some ways. The first one was about him coming into existence and being remembered. The second one was once he was remembered and existed, he started questioning himself and saying, "What am I?
Mm.
Who am I? What?" Like, actually, no, the second one was almost like, "Who am I?" And it really leads you down a garden path. I'm very proud of the second series. It really made me happy to write that one. But people obviously remember the first one a bit more fondly. The second one, at some point, he ends up in an asylum, and he's convinced that he's created the Marvel universe. They're trying to persuade him that he created Reed Richards and Spider-Man, and they're telling him, "This is really great, Robbie. What a fantastic the Hulk! What an interesting drawing you've done of this character because they're trying to make him think that he's not the Sentry, right?"
Yeah.
And I loved that. I was so proud of myself for writing that story. I thought it was really good. That's one of the best ones I've done. So the third one could be the bit about who he feels he's going to become, right? More than a person, maybe where do we go, right? Because we all have that question. But there's also a lot of there's so many ways in which I can write the stories about I don't believe in myself. And
Mm.
you see the triumph of the hero where he finds a way to believe in himself. He overcomes some of his mental health challenges. So it's not just the physical challenge, it's overcoming yourself, which I think is the hero story that you find in Spider-Man and the Hulk in any of them. So in a sense, there's lots of stories that could be written with the Hulk, with the Sentry.
And I think people would love to see it. And I think a lot of people do like the idea of essentially because there is an idea that I think we all on some level do. I mean, the idea of the mental illness and that we all kind of on some level have our struggles, but still being on some level, but still being able to potentially be that hero still. I think that's something that, and I think it's almost like that moment, shit, in Endgame where Thor, the big Thor, he's dealing with depression and all that, but still finds that he's worthy of the hammer. And that's that big moment. I think that everyone wants to see something with Bob where he can be like, "Hey, I have all this, but still, I can maybe be heroic. Still, maybe that's still,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, he's overcoming himself, right? That's
right?
what they do. I mean, you go back to take an early Robin Hood movie. This is why we like movies, right? You
Yeah,
got Errol Flynn as Robin Hood, and he's riding around, and he tries to take the shot with his bow and arrow, and he misses at the beginning of the film, and the Sheriff of Nottingham takes Meg Marion and takes her away. And then later on in the film, he's got one chance to make that shot again, and he makes it this time. Well done, Errol Flynn. Well done, Robin Hood. We like that, right? We want to see the people overcome the challenges that they had. That a little bit is some of the story that we can write for the Sentry, right? That he overcomes nuanced difficulties that we all overcome. We want to read a book and we want to read ourselves in that book. So I don't want to just write the golden Sentry suit and planets exploding. It's great to have them exploding. That's the bit that sort of visually brings you in. and the action and the fighting. I've learned a lot in comics, right? Because I never used to gravitate to that stuff, and I learned how to write that stuff as well, so that people get the piece that they're paying for as well, the fun escapism. But I really want the core of it to be the character.
Well, like I said, I think your fans would love to see a third Century series by you. That'd be amazing. Also, now's the time to do it.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to discuss with you, to get more information, is the idea of Meta Studios. So, can you kind of dive into Meta Studios a little bit?
Yeah, so my company in Georgia, Meta Studios, I founded it in 2014. So I always joke that we beat Zuckerberg by 6 or 7 years, actually. And I do own the trademark of Meta Studios for filmmaking. So, if at a certain point they decide to make this entertainment and trade stuff, we'll definitely have a problem with that. That's our thing. So I'm the one thing that people sort of see me for. They know a lot about what I do in comics, but anyone that also knows that I've written, I think, 6 platinum selling games. I've worked in video games for a long time. But I've also directed Ninja Turtles for Nickelodeon in animation. I work across all media. One of the mediums that I work in is Web3 and new media right now. So I've had this conversation a little bit, and indulge me for a second. We look at NFTs and we say, what a stupid idea, right? And the answer is not, that's not true. NFTs are a great idea. Crypto bros are a stupid idea. I've said this a few times that if someone attacks you with a hammer, you don't blame the hammer, you blame the person who's wielding the hammer. So an NFT is a fundamentally useful technology that we can use in any number of ways. And every time that I had worked with it, we had actually done storytelling mechanisms. We did treasure hunts with it. We use the technology to tell a new story. And I speak a lot at futurism conventions. So I'm often talking about the application of story across any medium, right? And so Meta Studios, we have like we do film, animation, television, comic books, video games, new media, NFTs. We work, if AI is a useful tool, and especially if AI doesn't steal from people, then you use AI as a tool to make anything, just like you use a ladder or a hammer, right? So Meta, you know, we are currently working on 2 game projects. We are working in Web3. We have a film. We have a couple of film stuff, things that we're doing. We make a lot of stuff and we do a lot of different things. And I've always known that I would not just be one thing. When I started in comics as a writer, people said, well, you're a horror writer because you do Hellblazer. I proved that wasn't true. And then they said, okay, you're a superhero writer. And I was like, that's just silly, right? I've done murder mysteries. I've done all kinds of stuff. Fairy Quest is one of the books I do is just this retelling of like fairy tales. I love all ages. I love horror. I love stories. I like anything. And Meta Studios really is kind of geared towards doing all of that stuff.
Now, when you say it's geared towards doing that stuff, or is it actually doing the develop? Like we do a video game, is it actually developing the video game, or is it the story producer for a company that would then make the video game?
So the answer is kind of half and half, actually. Yes, we would be involved in literally building out a game project from scratch and delivering it, right? Remember, we've democratized filmmaking. Anyone can get a Sony A7 camera and make a really good film if they know how to do it, right? If they can record sound great, if they can edit well, if they know how to do visual effects and all that kind of stuff that you need to make a good film. But we have democratized it a lot. Anyone can really make a game if you know how to make a game. You can get distribution via Steam. You can get any number of different ways. You can develop mobile. And so, we are in the business of making stuff, like starting with a blank piece of paper and finishing with stuff. So, yeah, in our case, one of the games that we're working on, we would absolutely build from scratch and deliver it. Start with nothing and end with something. That's the dictionary definition of what a producer does.
Well, I was looking at the website, and it's this place where you had different ideas that you're creating. For instance, like a character, something called like Ragman.
Yeah.
But it wasn't clear. Are these movies, video games? Like, what are those being developed into?
Yeah, our website is deliberately coy, to be fair. Couple of reasons for that. It shows the breadth of what we do, but you can't give it all away. And I've often found, in my career that the moment I create something, someone else says it belongs to them. Someone else takes credit for the idea. Someone just steals the idea. And honestly, it would happen so much more depressingly than you think. It happens all the time to me. So for our purposes, we have metastudios.com. It's our website, and we use it as kind of like a holding website to give people a sense of who we are. But we don't really need that website for much more, to be fair. If we're in production on a film or if we're working on a game or something like that, you don't really want to be handing all of that to everybody and saying, look at it. Now, that being said, actually, I'm going to kind of contradict myself and
Okay.
say, as we move into some of the film production, I think it's great to have a community in today's world, right? You want to build a community. And I'm expecting that if we actually do move a little further forward in production on some of the film projects that we're working on, we would probably bring people in. I actually have a big desire to bring people inside the veil, so to speak, and let people see how we're making the film and give them some agency in what they see, because that's really good for a community and that's really good for
Hmm.
the film.
So for Meta Studios, at least I know you can't give away a lot, but as fans of yours, what could we potentially look forward to as the most likely next completed project out of Meta Studios?
People have seen it before. I have a project called Sidekick that is not going to end up being called Sidekick actually when we finish producing it, simply because trademark and copyright reasons. There's nothing we can do about that. But Sidekick, such as people know it, is a comic book that I did with Chris Marino. We've done it for the last 15, 20 years, and I love it. It makes me happy. But the one thing about Sidekick is it gives everybody such a visceral reaction. They see it and they laugh or they yell or something. So when you have a project like that, it's its own self-evident truth. When people see it and they smile or they laugh, and it's just off color. Like one of the things I think people might absolutely like give me props for, it is so politically incorrect. It doesn't give a shit, right? I think people are so tired of looking over their shoulder and wondering if someone's going to get offended. And I've heard a few comedians say the same thing. And I've often wondered, like, how could you be a comedian now if you were imagine being a comedian and having a lawyer standing next to you. So every time you thought of a joke, they say you can't tell that joke because someone's going to get offended. In other
Hmm.
words, someone tells me they're offended, my answer will be, okay, congratulations. And, you
Well,
know,
I would say I haven't had a chance to interview a couple of comedians, stand-up comedians now. The one thing I've understood is probably the same thing with your project. If it's funny or if it's good, it doesn't matter.
doesn't matter. Absolutely.
But it's got to be good.
It's got to be
It's got to
good.
be funny.
Right. And so Sidekick is charmingly, stupidly funny. It's clever, stupid, right? It looks dumb, but it's actually very well thought out and very clever. It's basically, the shtick is always I help revive the Marvel universe. Now I feel really bad for what I did, so I want to try and destroy it. And it's a bunch of really stupid superheroes and sidekicks that have powers that are just absolutely pointless. We have hundreds of them. So the kind of powers they have, there's a guy called the Sherpa, and he can tell you exactly where he is in space. So they can literally pinpoint his place on the planet to within 3 feet, but so can your iPhone. So he's completely obsoleted at this point. We have just loads and loads and loads of characters like that, and they're all completely useless, but they're kind of charming because of it.
So where can our listeners buy those? Is it can it get through your website as well, or?
Right now, yeah, Sidekick is out of print actually as a comic, right? That's the way it existed. But what we're doing is we're going to develop it out. I think that when we get closer to developing the game project out and we can deliver the game and deliver the comic reprint, what be looking to do is to build out the animation side of it concurrently, so you can do the same assets for the animation and use and do and as for the game. And the game itself, like what people can understand, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is a little bit of like what the current state of the game industry is. If you sign into mobile, you'll often find that there are 19 parking games. And you're sitting there thinking, how many parking games could there be? And that's because somebody created a game where you would park cars or release them from their parking lot, and someone else said, I'm going to steal that idea. And so usually, to be fair, the Chinese just go, I'm going to make 25 hex games or 50 parking games. But where I submit that you could actually have fun with that is the Sidekick is geared to kind of steal from the Chinese, right? Like we're going to actually turn the tables, and everything that we do that's one of those types of game will actually be funny because it's got sidekick characters. So it's like the version that entertains you. So instead of tapping into Sidekick as a game just to play a game, you tap into it much more because it's a place to be entertained. And that's the kind of thing that I love to do. We got that. We got a number of projects, and we're probably going to release a few more. I just was actually talking to my producer Carrie Ann today about putting a bit more stuff up on the website. So we're going to kind of revamp it, but intentionally we don't kind of give the farm away, you know.
Well, like I said, anytime you're ready to promote something, please come back on the show, Mr. Jenkins. You're awesome, and like I said, I want to thank you so much for creating the Sentry. He's one of my favorite characters. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Have a good night, sir.
Good night.